In the late 1930s, military aviation was governed not by imagination, but by doctrine. Across Europe and North America, air power theorists believed that future wars would be decided by fleets of heavily armed, heavily armored bombers, flying deep into enemy territory. Speed mattered, but survivability mattered more. Aircraft were expected to defend themselves with gun turrets, armor plating, and redundancy. Any design that deviated from this orthodoxy was viewed not merely as risky, but irresponsible. It was within this rigid intellectual climate that one of the most extraordinary aircraft of the Second World War was conceived, an aircraft that, by the standards of its time, should never have succeeded. The de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito would enter service as a bomber with no defensive guns, minimal armor, and an airframe constructed largely from wood. It would be dismissed by senior officials, resisted by procurement boards, and regarded with suspicion by pilots trained to trust firepower over speed. And yet, by the end of the war, it would be recognized as one of the most versatile, survivable, and strategically influential aircraft ever built. To understand why the Mosquito was so revolutionary, and why it was nearly rejected, it is essential to examine the intellectual and institutional environment in which it was born. The strategic mindset before the war. In the aftermath of the First World War, air power theorists such as Julio Douhet, Hugh Trenchard, and Billy Mitchell argued that the bomber would dominate future conflicts. Douhet famously claimed that the bomber will always get through, asserting that no air defense could reliably stop massed bomber formations. This idea became a cornerstone of interwar air doctrine. By the mid-1930s, this belief had evolved into a consensus. Bombers must be self-defending fortresses. Aircraft such as Britain's Avro Lancaster, Germany's Heinkel He-11-1, and America's Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress embodied this philosophy. They were large, multi-engine machines bristling with machine guns protected by armor plating and designed to absorb damage while continuing toward their targets. Speed was desirable, but it was secondary. Bombers were expected to survive through collective defensive fire, not by outrunning interceptors. Fighter escorts, where available, were limited by range and often absent altogether. As a result, bomber designers prioritized payload, endurance, and firepower over aerodynamic efficiency. This mindset permeated air ministries, procurement committees, and operational planning staffs. Any aircraft proposal that challenged these assumptions faced intense scrutiny or outright rejection. The RAF's institutional conservatism. The Royal Air Force entered the late 1930s with a cautious, methodical approach to aircraft procurement. Scarred by the rapid technological obsolescence of the interwar period, the Air Ministry favored incremental improvements over radical innovation. Proven concepts were preferred to experimental ones, particularly as war loomed. The RAF's bomber requirements reflected this conservatism. Specifications called for multi-crew aircraft with defensive armament, armor protection, and standardized metal construction. Aluminum alloys had become the symbol of modernity. Wood was widely associated with outdated biplanes and civilian light aircraft. Against this backdrop, the notion of a fast bomber relying solely on speed for survival was viewed as dangerously optimistic. The Air Ministry believed that enemy fighters would inevitably catch up, and when they did, an unarmed bomber would be helpless. It was into this environment that Geoffrey de Havilland introduced an idea that appeared to contradict nearly every accepted principle of military aviation. Geoffrey de Havilland's heresy. Geoffrey de Havilland was not an outsider. He was one of Britain's most respected aircraft designers, with a career spanning from pre-World War I pioneers to successful commercial aviation ventures. Yet even his reputation could not shield him from skepticism when he proposed a radical departure from bomber orthodoxy. De Havilland believed that advances in aerodynamics and engine performance had created a new possibility, a bomber so fast that it would not need defensive guns at all. Instead of surviving by fighting, it would survive by avoiding combat entirely. At the heart of this idea was a simple calculation. Gun turrets were heavy, armor was heavy, additional crew members were heavy. Remove them, and an aircraft could be made dramatically lighter. That reduction in weight could be translated into speed, and speed, de Havilland argued, was the most effective form of protection. This concept directly challenged the RAF's assumptions. To many in the Air Ministry, it sounded naive, even reckless. Speed alone, they argued, could never replace firepower. But de Havilland was not finished. The controversial choice of wood. Perhaps the most shocking element of the proposed aircraft was not its lack of guns, but its construction. De Havilland suggested building the airframe primarily from wood, specifically a composite structure using plywood skins over a balsa core. In an era when aluminum aircraft symbolized technological progress, this decision seemed regressive. Critics associated wooden construction with fragility, inconsistency, and vulnerability to moisture and damage. The idea that a frontline combat aircraft could be built from wood struck many officials as absurd. De Havilland, however, saw advantages that others overlooked. Britain possessed a well-developed woodworking industry, skilled furniture makers, and a supply chain less vulnerable to strategic shortages of aluminum. Wood could be shaped into aerodynamically smooth forms, reducing drag. Moreover, wooden structures absorbed vibration well and were less prone to catastrophic fatigue cracking. Unspoken at the time, but later proven significant, was another benefit. Wood reflected radar waves poorly. While radar technology was still in its infancy, the Mosquito's wooden construction would later contribute to a smaller radar signature, complicating enemy detection. Still, these arguments failed to convince many decision-makers. To them, wood belonged in gliders and trainers, not in combat aircraft expected to penetrate heavily defended airspace. Initial rejection and quiet persistence. When de Havilland first presented his concept in 1938, the Air Ministry showed little interest. The RAF was already committed to existing bomber programs, and resources were stretched. There was no appetite for an unarmed wooden aircraft that defied conventional wisdom. Yet de Havilland did not abandon the idea. Instead, he refined it quietly, preparing detailed performance estimates and aerodynamic studies. He emphasized that the aircraft would not replace heavy bombers, but complement them, striking targets that required speed and precision rather than brute force. Crucially, de Havilland proposed building a prototype without an official specification, using company resources. This act of corporate confidence, bordering on defiance, kept the concept alive long enough for circumstances to change. Those circumstances would arrive sooner than anyone expected. War, crisis, and opportunity. The outbreak of the Second World War transformed priorities overnight. Britain faced existential threats, limited resources, and the urgent need for effective aircraft in large numbers. Losses mounted during the early phases of the conflict, and the limitations of existing doctrine became increasingly apparent. Heavy bombers proved vulnerable without fighter escort. Daylight raids resulted in unacceptable casualties, forcing the RAF into night operations with limited accuracy. The idea that bombers could simply get through was revealed as dangerously optimistic. In this environment of reassessment, speed began to regain importance. An aircraft that could fly faster than interceptors suddenly seemed less heretical and more pragmatic. The Mosquito concept, once dismissed, was reconsidered, not because doctrine had changed, but because reality had forced adaptation. An aircraft without a precedent. When the Mosquito finally received official support, it remained an anomaly. No other major power pursued a comparable design philosophy during the war. Germany emphasized armored attack aircraft and heavy fighters. The United States doubled down on massed bomber formations and escort fighters. Japan prioritized range and maneuverability, often at the expense of protection. The Mosquito stood alone, a high-speed, multi-role aircraft that rejected both heavy armor and defensive firepower. It was not designed to win dogfights or absorb punishment. It was designed to avoid them entirely. At the time of its conception, this philosophy seemed dangerously fragile. In hindsight, it would prove remarkably prescient. A question that defined its legacy. As the Mosquito moved from concept to prototype, one fundamental question hung over the project. Could speed truly replace guns? The answer would not be found in theory or committee meetings. It would be written in operational loss rates, mission success percentages, and the reactions of enemy pilots who found themselves unable to catch their prey. The aircraft that should have failed was about to enter a war that would test every assumption of interwar air power, and in doing so, it would expose the limitations of doctrine and the power of daring design. When the de Havilland Mosquito moved from an abstract proposal to a tangible design, it did so in direct opposition to nearly every accepted principle of military aircraft development in the late 1930s. This was not accidental. The Mosquito was not the product of compromise or incremental evolution. It was the result of a deliberate philosophical rejection of prevailing air power doctrine. To understand the Mosquito's design is to understand an argument that speed could replace guns, that simplicity could outperform complexity, and that intelligent engineering could overcome institutional inertia. Doctrine versus design. Military aircraft doctrine before the Second World War was prescriptive rather than exploratory. Specifications issued by air ministries defined not only performance targets, but design philosophy. Bombers were expected to be multi-crew, multi-engine aircraft with layered defenses, gun turrets, armor plating, redundant systems, and structural robustness. Designers rarely challenged these assumptions. Instead, they worked within them, competing to produce aircraft that best fulfilled the specification rather than questioning whether the specification itself was flawed. Geoffrey de Havilland did the opposite. He began not with a requirement, but with a question. What if the requirement was wrong? If bombers were being shot down because they were slow and predictable, then adding more guns merely increased weight and drag, making them slower still. If defensive firepower did not prevent interception, then it served primarily to reassure crews rather than to ensure survival. From this perspective, the heavily armed bomber was not a solution, but a symptom of doctrinal stagnation. Speed as the primary design driver. The Mosquito's design process began with speed, not as one attribute among many, but as the central organizing principle. Everything else was subordinate. To achieve this, de Havilland and his team made a series of radical decisions. Remove all defensive armament, minimize crew size, eliminate unnecessary structural mass, optimize aerodynamic cleanliness. Each decision reduced weight, drag, or complexity. Together, they produced an aircraft that was fundamentally different from its contemporaries. Most bombers of the era were burdened by multiple gun positions, each requiring structural reinforcement, ammunition storage, sighting equipment, and additional crew. The Mosquito had none of these. Its fuselage was clean, uninterrupted, and aerodynamically efficient. The result was not merely a faster aircraft, but a simpler one, simpler to build, simpler to maintain, and simpler to operate. The two-man crew concept. Another doctrinal challenge lay in crew composition. Bomber aircraft of the period typically carried crews of 5 to 7 men, each assigned to a specific defensive or navigational role. This arrangement reflected the belief that survival depended on collective firepower and constant vigilance. The Mosquito rejected this model entirely. It was designed to be flown by just 2 men, a pilot and a navigator bomb aimer. This decision reduced weight significantly and eliminated the need for internal movement during combat. It also demanded a higher level of training and coordination between crew members, as each individual carried greater responsibility. Critics argued that a two-man crew was dangerously vulnerable. There was no redundancy. If one man was incapacitated, the mission was effectively over. De Havilland countered that redundancy was meaningless if the aircraft could not survive long enough to benefit from it. By reducing exposure to enemy fire through speed and altitude, the Mosquito aimed to avoid the circumstances in which redundancy became necessary. Aerodynamics over armament. The Mosquito's aerodynamic design reflected an obsessive focus on minimizing drag. Its smooth fuselage contours, carefully shaped engine nacelles, and clean wing surfaces were all optimized for high-speed flight. Gun turrets, which created significant aerodynamic penalties, were entirely absent. Even the cockpit canopy was streamlined to reduce airflow disruption. Cooling systems were carefully integrated to avoid unnecessary drag, a notable contrast to many contemporaries with exposed radiators and intakes. This emphasis on aerodynamic efficiency was not unique in principle, but it was unprecedented in application. Other aircraft pursued speed within the constraints of heavy armament. The Mosquito pursued speed by eliminating those constraints altogether. The aircraft was, in effect, designed like a racing machine rather than a flying fortress. Engines as enablers, not compensators. The Mosquito's performance depended heavily on its engines, but not in the way that critics expected. Rather than using powerful engines to compensate for excessive weight, the design used engines to exploit a lightweight airframe. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines selected for the Mosquito were already proven in fighters such as the Spitfire and Hurricane. Their reliability and power output made them ideal for a high-speed aircraft. However, it was the relationship between engine power and airframe weight that mattered most. With far less mass to move, the Mosquito could translate engine power directly into speed and climb performance. This synergy allowed the aircraft to match, or exceed, the speed of many frontline fighters while carrying a meaningful payload. Challenging the procurement culture. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Mosquito's development was not technical, but institutional. The aircraft existed because de Havilland was willing to challenge the procurement culture of the RAF. Rather than waiting for an official specification, de Havilland effectively created his own. He presented the Mosquito as a solution to a problem the Air Ministry had not formally acknowledged: the vulnerability of conventional bombers. This approach was risky. Aircraft manufacturers depended on government contracts, and proposing an unrequested design carried financial and reputational dangers. Yet de Havilland believed that the logic of the design would eventually assert itself. In doing so, he exposed a fundamental tension within military procurement: the balance between control and innovation. Too much control stifled new ideas, too little risked chaos. The Mosquito emerged from this tension as a rare example of innovation succeeding despite institutional resistance. The absence of defensive guns, a psychological barrier. Perhaps the greatest obstacle to the Mosquito's acceptance was not technical feasibility, but psychology. Aircrew were accustomed to the presence of guns as a form of reassurance. Even when defensive fire was ineffective, it provided a sense of agency in combat. Removing guns required pilots and navigators to trust entirely in speed, altitude, and tactics. This was a profound cultural shift. It demanded not only a new aircraft, but a new mindset. The RAF's initial reluctance reflected this discomfort. The idea of sending crews into enemy airspace without the ability to fight back seemed morally questionable, even irresponsible. The assumption was that combat required visible means of resistance. The Mosquito challenged this assumption by redefining resistance as avoidance rather than engagement. Designing for flexibility. Although initially conceived as a fast bomber, the Mosquito's design incorporated an unusual degree of flexibility. Its internal bomb bay, modular nose sections, and adaptable avionics allowed it to be reconfigured for different roles with minimal structural changes. This adaptability was not an afterthought. It reflected de Havilland's belief that speed was a universal asset, valuable across multiple mission profiles. As a result, the Mosquito could evolve into a reconnaissance aircraft, a night fighter, a pathfinder, and a precision strike platform, all without sacrificing its core performance characteristics. In contrast, many specialized aircraft of the era were optimized for a single role and struggled to adapt as operational requirements changed. An aircraft built on confidence. The Mosquito was, above all, an aircraft built on confidence. Confidence in engineering, confidence in pilots, and confidence in the idea that war did not always reward brute force. This confidence bordered on defiance. It required rejecting advice from experienced officers, ignoring established doctrine, and trusting that empirical results would vindicate theoretical assumptions. At the time, this approach seemed dangerously optimistic. Yet it was precisely this willingness to challenge orthodoxy that allowed the Mosquito to succeed where more conservative designs faltered. The design that redefined survival. By the time the Mosquito entered production, it represented more than a new aircraft. It represented a new way of thinking about air combat. Survival was no longer defined by how much punishment an aircraft could absorb, but by how effectively it could avoid being hit at all. Firepower was no longer the default answer to vulnerability. Speed, altitude, and precision took its place. This shift would not immediately overturn existing doctrine. Heavy bombers would continue to dominate strategic planning. But the Mosquito had introduced a disruptive idea, one that would quietly influence air warfare long after the war ended. In the next chapter, that idea would be tested not in theory, but in materials and craftsmanship, through an airframe made of wood, built for a war of metal. Among all the unconventional decisions that defined the de Havilland Mosquito, none attracted more skepticism, or more ridicule, than its method of construction. In a period when aviation was rapidly abandoning fabric and wood in favor of stressed skin aluminum, the Mosquito's wooden airframe appeared not merely outdated, but anachronistic. To many contemporary observers, it seemed impossible that a frontline combat aircraft built largely from wood could survive the stresses of high-speed flight, combat maneuvering, and sustained wartime operations. Yet this assumption revealed a fundamental misunderstanding. The Mosquito was not a retreat into old technology, but a sophisticated application of materials, science, industrial strategy, and aerodynamic engineering. Its wooden structure was not a compromise. It was an advantage. The myth of obsolete materials. By the late 1930s, metal had become synonymous with progress in aviation. Aircraft such as the Spitfire Bf-109 and P-40 symbolized modernity through their sleek aluminum skins and monocoque structures. Wood, by contrast, was associated with fragile biplanes and training aircraft, relics of an earlier era. This cultural bias ignored a critical reality. Materials are not inherently obsolete. They become obsolete only when used without innovation. Geoffrey de Havilland understood this distinction. He had built his career on wooden aircraft, not because metal was unavailable, but because wood, when properly engineered, offered unique structural and manufacturing benefits. The Mosquito represented the culmination of decades of experience with advanced wooden construction techniques. The sandwich structure. Plywood, balsa, and science. At the heart of the Mosquito's airframe was a composite sandwich structure. Thin layers of birch plywood bonded to a core of lightweight balsa wood. This configuration produced a structure that was both light and remarkably strong. From an engineering perspective, the sandwich design exploited fundamental principles of mechanics. The outer skins carried tensile and compressive loads, while the balsa core maintained separation between them, dramatically increasing bending stiffness without adding significant weight. The result was an airframe with an exceptional strength-to-weight ratio. This was not traditional carpentry. It was applied structural engineering. The fuselage halves were molded over concrete forms, creating smooth, precise aerodynamic shapes that would have been difficult and expensive to achieve with metal. Once bonded together, the fuselage formed a rigid monocoque shell capable of withstanding high aerodynamic loads. Aerodynamic precision. Through wood offered another advantage that metal often could not: surface smoothness. Metal aircraft of the era relied on riveted skins, which inevitably introduced small irregularities and drag. The Mosquito's wooden skin, by contrast, could be sanded and finished to an exceptionally smooth surface. This reduced skin friction drag and contributed directly to the aircraft's high speed. In high-speed flight, small aerodynamic efficiencies produced disproportionate gains. The Mosquito's clean lines and smooth surfaces allowed it to extract maximum performance from its engines without increasing power output. This advantage was not theoretical. Operational data would later confirm that the Mosquito's aerodynamic efficiency played a significant role in its ability to outrun enemy fighters. Structural strength and combat survivability critics often assumed that wood was inherently fragile, particularly under combat conditions. This assumption proved incorrect. The Mosquito's wooden structure absorbed shock and vibration more effectively than metal airframes, reducing the risk of catastrophic failure under stress. Unlike metal, which could suffer from fatigue cracking and sudden structural collapse, wood tended to fail more gradually, providing warning before complete failure. Combat damage reports revealed another unexpected benefit. Shells and bullets that penetrated wooden structures often passed through without causing the same level of structural disruption seen in metal aircraft, where shrapnel and cracking could propagate through stressed skins. While no aircraft could be considered immune to damage, the Mosquito's wooden construction was far from the liability its critics predicted. Radar signature and an unintended advantage. When the Mosquito was designed, radar was still an emerging technology. Its implications for air combat were not fully understood, and no aircraft was deliberately designed with radar stealth in mind. Nevertheless, the Mosquito's wooden airframe offered an unintended but significant advantage: reduced radar reflectivity. Wood, unlike metal, reflected radio waves poorly. As a result, Mosquito aircraft were often more difficult to detect and track using early radar systems. This effect was not absolute. Engines, metal components, and crew still produced detectable signatures, but it complicated enemy detection and interception efforts. In the context of night operations and deep penetration missions, even marginal reductions in detectability could translate into improved survivability. In retrospect, the Mosquito can be seen as a primitive forerunner of stealth philosophy, achieving reduced observability not through advanced coatings or shaping, but through material choice. Industrial strategy in a time of scarcity. The decision to use wood was also a strategic response to wartime industrial realities. Aluminum was a critical resource, in constant demand for fighters, bombers, and naval aircraft. Britain faced severe constraints in both raw materials and manufacturing capacity. Wood, by contrast, was abundant. Britain possessed a vast network of skilled woodworkers, furniture manufacturers, and cabinet makers, many of whom were underutilized by the war economy. By designing an aircraft that could be built largely from wood, de Havilland effectively expanded the nation's aircraft production capacity. Mosquito components were manufactured across a decentralized network of civilian workshops, reducing vulnerability to bombing and easing pressure on metalworking industries. This distributed production model proved remarkably resilient. Even during periods of intense German bombing, Mosquito production continued with minimal disruption. Precision craftsmanship at scale. Producing a high-performance combat aircraft from wood required a level of craftsmanship that few believed could be achieved at scale. The Mosquito disproved this assumption. Strict quality control procedures ensured consistency across airframes. Adhesives were carefully selected and tested, with rigorous attention to bonding strength and durability. Skilled workers, many of whom had never built aircraft before, were trained to exacting standards. The result was an aircraft that combined artisanal craftsmanship with industrial efficiency, an unusual but highly effective combination. This approach contrasted sharply with the mass production methods used for many metal aircraft, which prioritized quantity over refinement. While those methods were essential for large bomber fleets, the Mosquito demonstrated that alternative production philosophies could coexist and succeed within a total war economy. Maintenance, repair, and field adaptability. Wooden construction also influenced maintenance and repair practices. Contrary to expectations, Mosquito aircraft were often easier to repair in the field than metal counterparts. Damaged sections could be patched or replaced using relatively simple tools and materials. This adaptability was particularly valuable in forward operating bases, where specialized metalworking equipment was scarce. Repairs that might ground a metal aircraft for extended periods could often be completed more quickly on a Mosquito. Such practical considerations rarely appear in doctrinal discussions, yet they play a decisive role in sustained operational effectiveness, defying the skeptics. By the time the Mosquito entered widespread service, its wooden airframe had confounded nearly every prediction made by its critics. It was fast, durable, adaptable, and reliable. Far from being a liability, its construction became one of its defining strengths. The aircraft's success forced a re-evaluation of assumptions that equated modernity with specific materials rather than performance outcomes. It demonstrated that innovation does not always mean abandoning the past. It can mean reimagining it. Material as philosophy. The Mosquito's wooden airframe was more than an engineering solution. It was a philosophical statement. It asserted that effectiveness in war arises not from adherence to fashion or doctrine, but from clear-eyed analysis of purpose and constraint. In choosing wood, de Havilland did not reject modernity. He redefined it. In the next chapter, the consequences of this philosophy would become unmistakably clear as the Mosquito's greatest weapon, speed, was tested against the fastest fighters of the Luftwaffe. If the Mosquito's wooden airframe represented a rejection of material orthodoxy, then its operational performance represented an even greater heresy. In combat, the aircraft validated a concept that many air power theorists had dismissed as unrealistic, that speed alone could function as a primary defensive weapon. The Mosquito did not merely fly fast for a bomber, it flew fast enough to redefine the relationship between attacker and defender. In doing so, it challenged one of the most deeply embedded assumptions of Second World War aerial combat, that survival depended on the ability to fight back. Rethinking survival in the air. Before the Mosquito, bomber survivability was understood in terms of resistance. Aircraft were designed to absorb damage, to continue flying despite hits, and to deter attackers through defensive fire. Survival was measured by how much punishment a machine could endure. The Mosquito inverted this logic. It sought not to resist attack, but to deny it altogether. This was a subtle but profound shift. If an aircraft could consistently fly faster than its interceptors, then the entire defensive paradigm, guns, armor, formations, became less relevant. Combat would occur only on the Mosquito's terms, if at all. This was not theoretical optimism. It was an empirically testable proposition, and the war would soon provide abundant data. Performance that defied categories. When the Mosquito entered service in 1941, its performance figures blurred the traditional distinctions between bombers and fighters. With 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and a lightweight airframe, early Mosquito variants achieved speeds exceeding 380 miles per hour at altitude. Later versions approached, and in some conditions surpassed, 400 miles per hour. These numbers were extraordinary for a multi-role aircraft carrying a bomb load. At the time, many frontline fighters struggled to match such speeds, particularly at operational altitudes. The Mosquito was not merely fast for a bomber. It was fast. Full stop. outrunning the Luftwaffe. The true test of speed as defense came in encounters with German interceptors. Early in the war, Luftwaffe fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190 were formidable opponents. Well-armed, highly maneuverable, and flown by experienced pilots, they represented the apex of German air power. Yet Mosquito crews quickly discovered an unexpected advantage. In level flight or shallow dive, they could often outrun their attackers. This did not mean the Mosquito was invulnerable. Poor positioning, low altitude, or surprise attacks could still prove fatal. But the balance of power was altered. Interceptors no longer enjoyed a guaranteed engagement. Many simply could not close the distance in time to fire effectively. German pilots reported frustration at seeing Mosquito aircraft accelerate away, immune to pursuit. In a war defined by attrition, this denial of engagement was itself a form of victory. Altitude, speed, and tactical freedom. Speed alone was not sufficient. The Mosquito's effectiveness derived from the interaction between speed, altitude, and tactics. Operating at high altitude, the Mosquito exploited thinner air to maximize true airspeed while reducing the performance envelope of enemy fighters. Combined with precise navigation and timing, this allowed Mosquito crews to penetrate defended airspace with unprecedented freedom. Unlike heavy bombers constrained by formation flying, the Mosquito operated singly or in small groups. This reduced visual detection, minimized radar exposure, and allowed crews to adjust routes dynamically in response to threats. Speed provided not just protection, but autonomy. The psychological dimension of speed had a psychological effect on both sides of the conflict. For Mosquito crews, it fostered confidence. Pilots reported a sense of control absent from conventional bomber operations. They were not passive targets relying on gunners for survival. They were active participants shaping their own fate through timing, altitude, and velocity. For defenders, the effect was corrosive. Interceptors trained to hunt bombers found themselves unable to engage effectively. Anti-aircraft crews struggled to track fast-moving targets with limited warning. The Mosquito became a symbol of elusiveness, a threat that appeared and vanished before defenses could react. In warfare, frustration is more than an emotion. It is a strategic effect. The Mosquito imposed that effect consistently. Speed versus armament, a quantitative reality. The debate over guns versus speed was ultimately settled not by philosophy, but by statistics. Operational records revealed that Mosquito loss rates were significantly lower than those of many heavily armed bombers operating in similar environments. While exact figures varied by mission type and period, the trend was unmistakable. Speed reduced exposure, and reduced exposure reduced losses. This did not imply that guns were useless. In some contexts, particularly close escort or sustained bombing campaigns, they remained essential. But the Mosquito demonstrated that defensive firepower was not the only path to survivability, and in some cases, it was not the most effective one. The aircraft had not removed guns irresponsibly. It had replaced them with a different form of defense, one grounded in physics rather than firepower. Speed as an enabler of precision. Another consequence of speed was accuracy. Heavy bombers operating at night or under heavy fire often sacrificed precision for survival. Evasive maneuvers, formation constraints, and defensive priorities reduced bombing accuracy. The Mosquito, by contrast, could approach targets quickly, strike with minimal warning, and depart before defenses fully responded. This compressed engagement window improved bombing precision and reduced collateral damage. Speed, in this sense, was not merely defensive. It enhanced offensive effectiveness. Limitations and trade-offs. The Mosquito's reliance on speed was not without risks. Engine failure, navigational error, or unexpected interception could be catastrophic. Without guns or armor, there was little margin for error. This demanded exceptional pilot skill and disciplined mission planning. The Mosquito was unforgiving of mistakes, and not every crew was suited to its demands. Yet these limitations were understood and accepted. The aircraft was never intended to replace all bombers, but to perform specific missions where its advantages outweighed its risks. In those missions, it excelled. Redefining the combat equation. By proving that speed could substitute for firepower, the Mosquito forced a reassessment of long-standing assumptions. It demonstrated that combat effectiveness was not solely a function of armament, but of the ability to control engagement conditions. This lesson would resonate far beyond the Second World War, influencing post-war aircraft design and air combat theory. The idea that not being there could be the best defense would later underpin reconnaissance aircraft, interceptors, and eventually stealth platforms. The Mosquito did not merely fly fast. It changed how speed was understood as a strategic resource, the weapon that could not be shot. In operational terms, the Mosquito became a paradox, an aircraft that survived not by fighting, but by denying the enemy the opportunity to fight at all. This was its greatest weapon. In the next chapter, speed would be paired with purpose as the Mosquito redefined bombing itself, not through mass destruction, but through precision strikes that reshaped the moral and strategic dimensions of air warfare. For much of the Second World War, bombing strategy was dominated by scale. Thousands of aircraft, millions of pounds of explosives, and entire cities reduced to rubble in the pursuit of industrial paralysis and moral collapse. Precision, while often invoked, was rarely achieved in practice. Weather, navigation errors, enemy defenses, and the inherent limitations of high-altitude bombing conspired to turn targeted strikes into area devastation. Against this backdrop, the de Havilland Mosquito introduced a radically different approach. It did not seek to overwhelm the enemy through mass. Instead, it pursued precision through speed, timing, and surprise. In doing so, it redefined what bombing could achieve, and at what cost. The limits of mass bombing. By 1942, the Royal Air Force had largely abandoned daylight precision bombing with heavy aircraft due to unsustainable losses. Night bombing offered greater survivability, but at the expense of accuracy. Even with improved navigation aids, the average bomb load often fell far from intended targets. This gap between intention and outcome had strategic consequences. Industrial facilities were damaged inconsistently. Civilian casualties mounted. The moral legitimacy of strategic bombing became increasingly contentious, even within Allied leadership. The problem was not a lack of destructive power, but a lack of control. A different philosophy of destruction. The Mosquito was never designed to carry the massive bomb loads of heavy bombers. Its payload was modest by comparison. Yet this limitation forced a reconsideration of objectives. Rather than attempting to destroy entire industrial zones, Mosquito missions focused on critical nodes, headquarters, power stations, bridges, radar installations, and transportation choke points. These targets, while smaller, often exerted disproportionate influence over enemy operations. This approach aligned with a more surgical conception of air power, one that emphasized disruption over annihilation, low-level attack, and tactical precision. One of the Mosquito's most distinctive bombing methods was low-level attack. Flying at treetop height, often at high speed, Mosquito crews could visually identify targets and deliver bombs with remarkable accuracy. This tactic carried risks. Low altitude exposed aircraft to small arms fire and light anti-aircraft weapons. Yet speed mitigated many of these dangers. The Mosquito's brief exposure window reduced the effectiveness of ground defenses, allowing crews to strike before defenders could react. The result was a level of precision unattainable by high-altitude bombers operating under blackout and cloud cover. Operation Jericho, a case study. Perhaps the most famous example of Mosquito precision bombing was Operation Jericho in February 1944. The target was the Amiens prison in occupied France, where members of the French resistance were being held by German authorities. The objective was not destruction for its own sake, but liberation. Mosquito aircraft were tasked with breaching the prison walls and destroying guard facilities, allowing prisoners to escape. The operation required extraordinary accuracy. Bombs had to be placed within meters of specific structures, at low altitude, under intense time pressure. The mission succeeded in breaching the walls and enabling escapes, though at the cost of civilian casualties and crew losses. It remains controversial, yet it demonstrated the Mosquito's unique capability, the ability to deliver precise effects under conditions that would have been impossible for conventional bombers. Targeted strikes on occupation infrastructure. Mosquito precision bombing was not limited to dramatic rescue missions. Throughout occupied Europe, Mosquito squadrons targeted Gestapo headquarters, SS facilities, and administrative centers. These strikes served multiple purposes. They disrupted enemy command and control, eliminated key personnel, and delivered a powerful psychological message to both occupiers and occupied populations. Importantly, they demonstrated that air power could be applied discriminately, at least in relative terms, against specific instruments of repression. Timing as a weapon. Precision bombing with the Mosquito relied as much on timing as on accuracy. Many missions were conducted during daylight when visibility was optimal. Attacks were often scheduled to coincide with moments of maximum effect, shift changes, meetings, or symbolic dates. The Mosquito's speed made such timing feasible, allowing aircraft to arrive precisely when intended. This temporal precision magnified the impact of relatively small bomb loads. The right bomb, delivered at the right moment, could achieve results disproportionate to its size. Pathfinding and the enabling role. The Mosquito's contribution to bombing accuracy extended beyond its own payload. In its pathfinder role, Mosquito aircraft marked targets for heavy bomber formations using flares and markers. This task demanded speed and survivability. Pathfinder aircraft had to reach targets ahead of the main force, operate over heavily defended areas, and remain accurate under fire. The Mosquito's performance made it ideally suited to this role. By improving target marking, it indirectly increased the effectiveness of mass bombing while reducing wasted effort and unintended destruction. In this way, the Mosquito functioned as a force multiplier, enhancing the impact of aircraft far larger and more numerous than itself. Ethical implications of precision. While the Mosquito did not eliminate civilian casualties, it introduced a meaningful distinction between indiscriminate and targeted air power. Its operations raised difficult ethical questions. Precision strikes could save lives by avoiding area bombing, but they could also concentrate violence in specific locations with tragic consequences. The Amiens raid remains a subject of debate precisely because it embodies this tension. What is clear is that the Mosquito expanded the moral vocabulary of air warfare. It demonstrated that alternatives to mass destruction were possible, even if imperfect. Measuring effectiveness beyond tonnage. Traditional metrics of bombing effectiveness focused on tonnage, dropped, and targets destroyed. The Mosquito challenged these metrics. Its success was measured in disruptions caused, leaders eliminated, operations delayed, and morale affected. These effects were harder to quantify, but no less real. In many cases, a single Mosquito mission achieved results that would have required dozens of heavy bombers to replicate, often with far greater collateral damage. A new language of air power. By redefining bombing as a tool of precision rather than mass, the Mosquito anticipated post-war developments in air power theory. The emphasis on critical nodes, timing, and accuracy would later underpin doctrines of interdiction, decapitation strikes, and precision-guided munitions. The Mosquito did not possess smart weapons or digital targeting systems. Its precision was human, analog, and fragile. Yet it demonstrated what was possible when speed, planning, and skill converged. The bomber that changed the question. The Mosquito did not ask how much destruction air power could deliver. It asked where and when that destruction mattered most. In the next chapter, the aircraft's versatility would reach another extreme as it transitioned from bomber to hunter, using speed not just to evade the enemy, but to seek them out in the darkness of night. As the war evolved, the de Havilland Mosquito underwent a transformation that few aircraft in history have matched. Designed initially as a fast bomber, it would become one of the most effective night fighters of the Second World War. This role reversal, from unarmed penetrator to heavily armed hunter, was not a contradiction of the Mosquito's philosophy, but an extension of it. Speed, once again, was the enabling factor. The night war over Europe. By 1941, the air war over Europe had entered a nocturnal phase. Heavy bombers operated primarily at night to reduce losses, while German bombers conducted raids under cover of darkness to evade British defenses. Night had become a contested domain, defined by uncertainty, limited visibility, and rapidly advancing technology. In this environment, traditional visual interception was ineffective. Success depended on radar, coordination, and aircraft capable of sustained high-speed flight in darkness. The RAF required a night fighter that could intercept enemy bombers before they reached their targets, and survive long enough to do so repeatedly. Why the Mosquito was suited for the role. The Mosquito's suitability as a night fighter stemmed from characteristics already embedded in its design. Its speed allowed it to patrol large areas quickly and to close on targets identified by ground-controlled interception. Its stability at high speed made it an effective gun platform, while its two-man crew proved ideal for dividing tasks between flying and radar operation. Unlike single-seat fighters, the Mosquito could accommodate increasingly complex avionics without overwhelming the pilot. From bomber to hunter. Structural adaptation. Transforming the Mosquito into a night fighter required significant modifications, but not a fundamental redesign. The bomb bay was repurposed to house radar equipment and additional fuel. The aircraft was armed with a formidable battery of 420mm Hispano cannons mounted in the lower fuselage and 4.303 machine guns in the nose. This concentration of forward-facing firepower allowed Mosquito night fighters to destroy enemy bombers with short, lethal bursts. Despite these additions, the aircraft retained much of its speed advantage. While slightly heavier, it remained faster than many contemporary fighters, particularly at night operating altitudes. Airborne interception radar. The defining technology of night fighting was airborne interception radar. Early radar sets were bulky, fragile, and imprecise by modern standards. They required skilled operators to interpret signals and guide pilots toward unseen targets. The Mosquito's two-man crew proved essential in this regard. The radar operator handled detection and tracking, while the pilot focused on flying and attack. This division of labor reduced workload and improved effectiveness. As radar technology improved, Mosquito night fighters became increasingly lethal, capable of detecting and intercepting bombers well before they reached their objectives. Engagement without visibility. Night combat differed fundamentally from daylight dogfighting. Visual cues were minimal. Engagements were brief and often occurred at close range. In this environment, the Mosquito's stability and firepower were decisive. Once guided into position, the aircraft could unleash concentrated fire with devastating effect. German bomber crews often had little warning. Attacks came from below or behind, exploiting blind spots and minimizing exposure to defensive fire. Speed ensured that Mosquito fighters could disengage quickly after an attack, reducing the risk of retaliation. The defense of Britain Mosquito night fighters played a critical role in defending Britain from German bombing raids. Their effectiveness contributed to the gradual erosion of the Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign. Loss rates for German bombers increased, while RAF interceptions became more reliable. Over time, the balance shifted. Night skies that had once favored the attacker became increasingly hostile. This shift was not solely the result of the Mosquito. It reflected an integrated air defense system combining radar, command and control, and interceptor aircraft. But the Mosquito was one of its most effective components. Countering the V-1 threat. Later in the war, the Mosquito would face a new challenge: the V-1 flying bomb. These pilotless weapons traveled at high speed and low altitude, presenting a difficult interception problem. Many fighters struggled to catch them. The Mosquito, however, was among the few aircraft capable of intercepting V-1s consistently. Its speed allowed it to overtake the flying bombs, while its firepower provided multiple methods of destruction. In this role, the Mosquito demonstrated once again that speed was not merely defensive, it was decisive. Psychological impact on the enemy. For German bomber crews, the presence of Mosquito night fighters added a new layer of fear. Unlike slower interceptors, the Mosquito could appear suddenly and without warning. Reports from Luftwaffe personnel reveal growing anxiety about night operations, particularly as Mosquito squadrons became more effective. In warfare, psychological pressure can be as destructive as physical damage. By denying the enemy a sense of safety even under cover of darkness, the Mosquito amplified its strategic impact. Limitations of the night fighter role. Despite its size made it less maneuverable than smaller single-seat fighters, particularly in tight engagements. Its effectiveness depended heavily on radar support and coordination with ground control. When these systems failed or were disrupted, interception became more difficult. Yet these limitations were acceptable trade-offs. The Mosquito was not designed for dogfighting, it was designed for interception, and in that role, it excelled. From defense to control. By mid-war, the Mosquito had helped shift night combat from a defensive necessity to a form of control. The RAF was no longer merely reacting to enemy raids, it was actively shaping the nocturnal battle space. This transformation underscored a central theme of the Mosquito's career: adaptability. The aircraft's design philosophy proved robust across roles that its creators had never fully envisioned. In the next chapter, that adaptability would reach its most strategic expression as the Mosquito became the eyes of the Allies, flying deeper, faster, and farther into enemy territory than almost any other aircraft of its time. While bombs and guns captured public attention, the outcome of the Second World War depended just as heavily on information, its collection, interpretation, and timely distribution. In this quieter, less visible struggle, the de Havilland Mosquito emerged as one of the most important aircraft of the conflict. As a strategic reconnaissance platform, it provided the Allies with something no other aircraft could offer in the same measure: speed, reach, and survivability, combined with photographic precision. The Mosquito did not merely observe the war, it shaped it. The centrality of intelligence in modern war. By the early 1940s, industrialized warfare had reached a level of complexity that made intelligence indispensable. Strategic decisions depended on accurate knowledge of enemy production, troop movements, infrastructure, and defensive preparations. Aerial reconnaissance had existed since the First World War, but its effectiveness was limited by aircraft performance. Slow, lightly armed reconnaissance planes were vulnerable to interception. High-altitude flights often sacrificed image clarity, while low-altitude missions were extremely dangerous. The Allies required an aircraft capable of penetrating deep into enemy territory, collecting high-quality intelligence, and returning reliably. Why the Mosquito was ideal for reconnaissance. The Mosquito's attributes aligned almost perfectly with the demands of strategic reconnaissance. Its speed reduced exposure to enemy fighters. Its high ceiling allowed it to operate above much of the flak envelope. Its stability made it an excellent photographic platform, and its two-man crew configuration allowed a dedicated navigator-photographer to manage complex equipment. Unlike bombers or fighters adapted for reconnaissance, the Mosquito was purpose-built for efficiency rather than compromise. Photographic intelligence at unprecedented scale, Mosquito reconnaissance variants were equipped with advanced cameras capable of capturing high-resolution images from altitude. These cameras could photograph vast areas in a single mission, producing imagery that revealed fine structural details. Factories, airfields, submarine pens, missile sites, nothing was beyond the Mosquito's reach. The speed at which these missions could be conducted was critical. Targets could be photographed and analyzed quickly, allowing planners to respond to changes in enemy activity with minimal delay. In an era before satellites and drones, this capability was revolutionary. Penetrating the deepest defenses. Some of the Mosquito's most important reconnaissance missions involved flying deep into the heart of the Third Reich. These flights were often conducted without escort, relying entirely on speed and altitude for survival. German air defenses, while formidable, struggled to intercept aircraft that appeared briefly and disappeared just as quickly. The psychological effect on German defenders was significant. The realization that Allied aircraft could penetrate supposedly secure airspace at will undermined confidence in defensive systems. Mapping the enemy's war machine. The intelligence gathered by Mosquito reconnaissance squadrons played a critical role in shaping Allied strategy. Photographs revealed the location and capacity of industrial facilities, the construction of fortifications, and the movement of military units. They exposed deception efforts and confirmed or disproved reports from resistance networks. This information was not static. It was used to track changes over time, expansions, repairs, camouflage efforts, and dispersal strategies. In effect, the Mosquito allowed the Allies to observe the enemy's war machine in motion. The V-weapon threat. One of the Mosquito's most strategically significant reconnaissance contributions involved the German V-weapon program. Mosquito aircraft were among the first to photograph V-1 launch sites and V-2 rocket facilities. These images provided crucial evidence of the scale and nature of the threat. Armed with this intelligence, Allied planners could target launch sites, disrupt supply chains, and accelerate defensive preparations. Without Mosquito reconnaissance, the V-weapon threat might have achieved far greater impact. Supporting D-Day and the liberation of Europe. In the lead-up to the Normandy landings, accurate intelligence was essential. The success of the invasion depended on precise knowledge of German defenses, troop deployments, and infrastructure. Mosquito reconnaissance missions mapped coastal fortifications, photographed beach obstacles, and monitored enemy movements. This information fed directly into operational planning at the highest levels. The aircraft's ability to operate repeatedly over contested areas ensured that planners had up-to-date intelligence rather than outdated snapshots. Speed as a shield for information reconnaissance missions are inherently vulnerable. They require aircraft to fly predictable routes and maintain stable flight for photography. The Mosquito's speed mitigated these vulnerabilities. Even when detected, it was often too fast to intercept. This reduced the risk of losing both aircraft and the invaluable intelligence it carried. In this role, speed protected not just crews, but information itself. Accuracy, analysis, and impact. Intelligence is only as valuable as its interpretation. The clarity and consistency of Mosquito photographic imagery allowed analysts to draw confident conclusions. These conclusions influenced decisions ranging from bombing priorities to invasion timing. They also enabled rapid assessment of damage after Allied strikes, closing the feedback loop between action and information. The Mosquito thus became an integral part of a larger intelligence ecosystem, connecting reconnaissance, analysis, and operations. An invisible contribution. Unlike bombers or fighters, reconnaissance aircraft rarely receive public recognition. Their successes are measured in avoided surprises and informed decisions rather than visible destruction. Yet the Mosquito's reconnaissance role arguably saved countless lives by enabling more accurate targeting and better-informed strategy. It exemplified a form of air power that was subtle, indirect, and profoundly effective. Seeing without being seen. By the end of the war, the Mosquito had established a reputation as an aircraft that could go anywhere and return with the truth. It did not dominate the skies through combat alone. It dominated them through information. In the next chapter, this very ability, to appear where it was least expected, would frustrate the Luftwaffe to the point of near impotence, as Germany struggled to stop an aircraft that seemed to exist outside the rules of engagement. By the middle years of the Second World War, the de Havilland Mosquito had become more than a tactical problem for Germany. It was a strategic irritation. It exposed the limits of Luftwaffe air defense, challenged German assumptions about interception, and forced the diversion of scarce resources toward a threat that refused to be neutralized. Despite technological sophistication and experienced pilots, Germany struggled to find an effective answer to an aircraft that seemed to operate outside conventional constraints. Recognition of a unique threat. German intelligence was quick to recognize that the Mosquito represented something fundamentally different. Unlike heavy bombers, it did not rely on mass. Unlike fighters, it did not seek combat. It appeared unpredictably, struck with precision, gathered intelligence, and vanished. This irregularity made it difficult to classify and even harder to counter. Luftwaffe reports increasingly identified the Mosquito as a priority target, not because of its numbers, but because of its disproportionate impact. Interceptors. Without advantage. Germany's air defense doctrine assumed that interceptors would enjoy advantages of position, warning, and numbers. Against the Mosquito, these assumptions often failed. By the time radar or visual observers detected Mosquito aircraft, interception windows were extremely short. Fighters scrambled too late or arrived at altitude without sufficient speed to close the gap. Even when contact was made, the Mosquito's speed and clean aerodynamics allowed it to disengage with relative ease. This was not a failure of German pilots. It was a mismatch of concepts. The FW-190 and Bf-109, capable but constrained. The Focke-Wulf, FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 were formidable fighters by any standard. Yet their effectiveness against the Mosquito was limited by operational realities. Climb rates, engine performance at altitude, and the need to carry additional fuel or equipment for interception reduced their ability to pursue a fast, high-flying target. Moreover, interceptors optimized for dogfighting were ill-suited to chasing an aircraft that refused to turn and fight. The Mosquito did not defeat these fighters in combat. It denied them combat altogether. The Me-262. Question: the introduction of the Messerschmitt. Me-262 jet fighter raised hopes within the Luftwaffe that the Mosquito threat could finally be neutralized. In terms of raw speed, the Me-262 was superior. In practice, however, it faced severe constraints. Jet engines were unreliable and fuel-hungry. Operational readiness was limited. Interception required precise timing and favorable conditions. While isolated successes occurred, the Me-262 arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to alter the balance. The Mosquito continued to operate with relative impunity. Anti-aircraft artillery and radar Germany invested heavily in flak and radar, creating one of the most extensive air defense networks in history. Against mass bomber formations, this system was deadly. Against the Mosquito, its effectiveness was inconsistent. The aircraft's speed reduced engagement time. Its altitude flexibility allowed crews to adapt to defensive zones, and its smaller radar signature complicated tracking and fire control. Flak could still bring down Mosquito aircraft, but not at a rate sufficient to deter operations. Resource diversion and strategic cost. One of the Mosquito's most significant impacts was indirect. To counter it, Germany was forced to allocate fighters, radar coverage, and personnel that might otherwise have been used against heavy bombers or on the Eastern Front. This diversion of resources imposed a strategic cost disproportionate to the Mosquito's numbers. In warfare, forcing the enemy to react inefficiently is a form of victory. The Mosquito excelled at this. Psychological warfare by design, beyond physical damage, the Mosquito inflicted psychological strain on German defenses. Its ability to strike symbolic targets, government buildings, headquarters, and urban centers, undermined the perception of security. The knowledge that Allied aircraft could appear at will eroded confidence in defensive systems. For civilians and military personnel alike, the Mosquito became a reminder that no place was truly safe. An enemy without a solution. Despite experimentation and adaptation, Germany never developed a reliable, scalable solution to the Mosquito problem. This failure was not due to incompetence, but to structural constraints. The Luftwaffe was fighting a war on multiple fronts, with diminishing resources and increasing technological pressure. The Mosquito exploited these constraints relentlessly. The measure of success. The true measure of the Mosquito's effectiveness lies not in kill counts, but in the enemy's response. An aircraft that forces constant adjustment, drains resources, and undermines confidence has achieved strategic success, even if it never dominates the skies in conventional terms. By this measure, the Mosquito was extraordinarily effective, beyond the tactical horizon. As the war drew toward its conclusion, the Mosquito's reputation as an unstoppable intruder was firmly established. Yet its greatest significance lay beyond immediate operations. It had demonstrated that air defense systems, no matter how sophisticated, could be circumvented by speed, flexibility, and intelligent design. In the final chapters, we will examine how this legacy was quantified, debated, and ultimately enshrined in the history of air warfare. By the final years of the Second World War, the de Havilland Mosquito had acquired an almost mythical status. Allied aircrew praised it as virtually untouchable. German defenders regarded it with frustration and resignation. Post-war narratives would often elevate the aircraft to near-legendary proportions, portraying it as a machine that defied physics, doctrine, and danger alike. Yet history demands more than admiration. It demands measurement. To understand the true significance of the Mosquito, its reputation must be tested against operational data, loss rates, mission profiles, production figures, and comparative effectiveness. Only by separating myth from measurable reality can its place in air warfare be properly assessed. Production numbers and strategic presence. Between 1940 and 1950, approximately 7,800 Mosquito aircraft were produced in multiple variants. This figure was modest compared to heavy bombers like the Lancaster or B-17, which were built in far greater numbers. Yet raw production totals tell only part of the story. The Mosquito was never intended to dominate through quantity. Its strategic value lay in how often it could fly, how quickly it could be turned around, and how many distinct roles it could fulfill with minimal modification. In terms of operational density, missions flown per aircraft, the Mosquito ranked among the most intensively used aircraft of the war. Loss rates in context. One of the most frequently cited claims about the Mosquito is its exceptionally low loss rate. While precise figures vary depending on time period and mission type, the overall trend is clear. Mosquito squadrons suffered significantly fewer losses per sortie than most bomber units. Daylight Mosquito operations, particularly reconnaissance and precision strike missions, often recorded loss rates well below 1%. Even in night fighter and pathfinder roles over heavily defended territory, survivability remained high. By comparison, early war daylight bombing by heavy aircraft sometimes incurred loss rates exceeding 5% per mission, levels that were operationally unsustainable. These statistics do not suggest invulnerability. Mosquito aircraft were shot down by fighters, flak, and accidents, but they do indicate that speed, altitude, and tactical flexibility were highly effective substitutes for armor and massed defensive fire. Mission effectiveness. Over time, effectiveness is not measured solely by survival. It is measured by outcomes. Mosquito reconnaissance missions consistently delivered usable intelligence. Precision bombing raids achieved their objectives with fewer aircraft and less collateral damage. Night fighter squadrons recorded growing interception success as radar technology matured. Importantly, Mosquito effectiveness improved over time rather than diminishing. As crews gained experience and systems evolved, the aircraft's strengths became more pronounced. This adaptability stands in contrast to some aircraft whose effectiveness declined as enemy countermeasures improved. Maintenance, availability, and sustainability. Another dimension often overlooked in popular accounts is operational availability. The Mosquito's relatively simple systems, combined with robust construction, resulted in high serviceability rates. Aircraft could be maintained and returned to service quickly, even under wartime conditions. Wooden construction, initially feared as a maintenance liability, proved manageable with proper procedures. Field repairs were often faster than those required for metal aircraft with structural damage. High availability translated into consistent operational presence, an invisible but decisive factor in sustained warfare. Comparative cost and efficiency. From an economic perspective, the Mosquito was remarkably efficient. It required fewer crew members than heavy bombers, reducing training time and personnel losses. Its production used less strategic metal, easing pressure on industrial supply chains. Its missions often replaced or enhanced operations that would otherwise require larger forces. When measured in terms of effect achieved per resource invested, the Mosquito performed exceptionally well. This efficiency did not make heavy bombers obsolete, but it demonstrated that alternative approaches could yield high returns under specific conditions. The myth of invincibility. Post-war narratives sometimes portray the Mosquito as virtually immune to enemy action. This portrayal, while flattering, is misleading. The aircraft was vulnerable under certain conditions. Low-altitude operations exposed it to small arms fire. Engine failures could be fatal. Poor weather and navigational errors claimed lives. Crews were keenly aware of these risks. The Mosquito demanded discipline and precision. It rewarded competence but punished mistakes. Recognizing these realities does not diminish the aircraft's achievements. It grounds them. Enemy assessments and captured records. German records provide a valuable external perspective. Luftwaffe reports acknowledged the difficulty of intercepting Mosquito aircraft and noted the disproportionate effort required to counter them. They did not describe the aircraft as invulnerable, but as operationally inconvenient and strategically disruptive. This distinction matters. The Mosquito did not dominate the skies through force. It dominated through inefficiency imposed on the enemy. A statistical anomaly or a structural success? The key question raised by the Mosquito's record is whether its success was unique or replicable. Was it a statistical anomaly, an aircraft that happened to exploit a narrow window of technological imbalance? Or was it the result of principles that could be applied more broadly? The evidence suggests the latter. Speed, simplicity, and role flexibility proved consistently valuable across contexts. The Mosquito's success was not accidental, it was structural. Measured achievement. When stripped of myth, the Mosquito emerges not as a miracle machine, but as a rigorously effective one. Its performance metrics support its reputation, its limitations contextualize it. Together, they form a balanced historical assessment. In an era dominated by extremes, mass destruction on one hand, technological experimentation on the other, the Mosquito represented a rare equilibrium between innovation and practicality.
Approaching the final judgment, statistics can illuminate effectiveness, but they cannot fully capture legacy. To understand why the Mosquito remains relevant decades after its last flight, one must look beyond numbers to influence to the ideas it validated and the futures it shaped. That legacy will be the subject of the final chapter. When the Second World War ended, thousands of aircraft faded quietly into obsolescence. They had been built for a specific conflict, optimized for specific conditions, and rendered redundant by rapid technological change. The de Havilland Mosquito followed a different trajectory. It did not simply conclude its wartime service, it entered history as a reference point. The Mosquito's true legacy lies not in any single mission or statistic, but in the ideas it proved viable under the harshest possible conditions. Those ideas would echo through post-war aviation doctrine, aircraft design, and the philosophy of air power itself. A challenge to the heavy bomber paradigm, the Mosquito did not defeat the heavy bomber concept, nor was it intended to. Strategic bombing campaigns continued to rely on massed formations and large payloads. What the Mosquito did accomplish was subtler and arguably more enduring. It demonstrated that effectiveness in air warfare was not exclusively a function of size, firepower, or numbers. By achieving results with smaller crews, lighter airframes, and targeted missions, the Mosquito exposed the limitations of a one-size-fits-all approach to air power. It validated the idea that different strategic problems demanded different aerial solutions. This lesson would inform post-war air forces as they diversified their fleets rather than concentrating solely on a single aircraft type. Speed as doctrine, not just performance. Before the Mosquito, speed was considered an advantage. After the Mosquito, it became a doctrine. The aircraft proved that speed could be systematically leveraged to reduce losses, increase mission success, and impose disproportionate costs on the enemy. This insight influenced the development of post-war interceptors, reconnaissance platforms, and strike aircraft. From high-altitude reconnaissance planes to supersonic bombers, the principle was the same. Avoid engagement by denying the enemy time and opportunity. The Mosquito did not invent this idea, but it operationalized it convincingly. Multi-role flexibility is a strategic asset. One of the Mosquito's most remarkable attributes was its adaptability. Bomber, night fighter, reconnaissance platform, pathfinder, interceptor, the Mosquito performed each role effectively without fundamental redesign. This flexibility reduced logistical complexity and allowed rapid adaptation to changing strategic needs. Post-war aircraft designers took note. The trend toward multi-role platforms in modern air forces owes much to wartime lessons learned from aircraft like the Mosquito. While later technology would vastly increase complexity, the underlying concept versatility over specialization remains influential. Human skill over mechanical redundancy. The Mosquito placed extraordinary demands on its crews. With minimal redundancy and limited defensive measures, success depended on skill, discipline, and judgment. This emphasis on human performance anticipated later shifts in air combat philosophy, where training, situational awareness, and decision-making became as important as hardware. In this sense, the Mosquito treated its crews not as interchangeable operators, but as integral components of the weapon system. Early lessons in reduced observability. Although not designed as a stealth aircraft, the Mosquito demonstrated the tactical value of reduced detectability. Its wooden construction, smooth surfaces, and small visual profile complicated enemy detection and interception. These effects, though incidental, foreshadowed later efforts to reduce aircraft observability through materials and shaping. The Mosquito showed that avoiding detection could be as powerful as defeating defenses directly. Industrial and economic implications. The Mosquito also left a legacy in industrial strategy. By leveraging non-traditional manufacturing networks and conserving critical materials, it demonstrated how design choices could expand production capacity under constraint. This approach influenced post-war thinking about resilience, decentralization, and the integration of civilian industry into defense production, a model of intelligent restraint. In an era defined by unprecedented destruction, the Mosquito represented a form of restraint. Its precision missions aimed to achieve specific effects rather than indiscriminate devastation. While not free from controversy or tragedy, this approach offered an alternative vision of air power, one that emphasized discrimination and purpose. This vision would later resonate in debates over precision-guided weapons and the ethical application of force. Why the Mosquito still matters. Decades after its last operational flight, the Mosquito continues to attract historians, engineers, and military thinkers. It matters because it illustrates a timeless principle that innovation often emerges from questioning assumptions rather than refining them. The Mosquito succeeded not because it had more of everything, but because it had less of the right things, the aircraft that redefined possibility. The Havilland Mosquito began its life as an idea that contradicted doctrine, defied fashion, and challenged institutional comfort. It ended as one of the most respected aircraft of the Second World War, not through brute force, but through intelligent design. In doing so, it left behind more than a record of missions flown and enemies avoided. It left behind a way of thinking about air warfare that remains relevant in an age of satellites, drones, and stealth aircraft. The Mosquito reminds us that in war, as in engineering, greatness often comes not from adding more but from knowing precisely what to remove.